Now that we have this feature that we can edit our to-do items, it would be nice if I didn't have to click twice on an item in order to get it focused and get my cursor so I can start typing. What we really would want to happen that as soon as the input appears, I'd like to get the actual DOM element for this input and call the focus method on it. Some frameworks, especially the more component-based ones, there might be some kind of onCreate or onMount hook that you could use in the view to get access to the element, but HyperApp isn't like that. To HyperApp, the view is just a pure reflection of the state and nothing more, no more logic than that. Anything you want to happen needs to happen in the actions. Start editing is the action that makes the input appear. That's the place to perform this operation. So we'll return the state same as before, but besides returning that state, we find the element, document, query selector, it's in the item list, the section with the class item list, and it's an input with type text, and that should be unique enough to find just one item. And if we find it, then we say lm focus. This isn't going to work because this is happening even before the app has had a chance to render the element. So we need to wrap it in a request animation frame and actually another request animation frame, just because the render will be scheduled after this, so we need to skip ahead twice. Okay, so technically this is going to work. This is going to do what we want. And I'm just going to show that first. So now we click, it's immediately focused, and we click the other one and it's immediately focused. But this is not the appropriate way to solve the problem. And that is because HyperApp wants to support you in having pure actions, meaning that they only return some calculation based on the inputs and don't do anything else on the side like this thing here is doing. That makes it impure. A pure action only returns data and does nothing else. So what can we do? Well, I said a pure action only returns data. We could do this. We could return the state and also, besides, a function that does something, that does this, for instance. This almost would work. Actually, this function needs to be wrapped in square brackets for reasons you'll understand later. This is something that HyperApp can understand, and if you think about it, this is pure data now, because the function is just a function. It's not doing anything, we're simply returning it. When HyperApp sees an action return an array where the first item is state, it'll assume that the rest are effects, so-called functions that HyperApp should call for you. So HyperApp will understand to do these things. To prove it, ta-da! And actually, since effects are scheduled after the render is scheduled, we can remove one of these request animation frames and it'll still work. Now, obviously, focusing an element, that's something generic. That's something we don't necessarily want to have inline here. We could define it as a function out here. Function focus effect. And then we could just have it here in these square brackets. Like that. That's nothing HyperApp specific. This is just JavaScript. Now let's get to the reason for these angle brackets. You could use this effect in a lot of places, but you'd want to pass different options to it. Like, for instance, we'd want to say that the selector is in this specific case, the specific selector. HyperApp, seeing this tuple of an effect function and an options object, will pass the options object as an argument to the effect function. It's actually going to pass it as the second argument, and we'll talk about the first argument later. So that way we could say options selector instead. And this still works. Conventionally, you'd have focuser, selector, to turn that into focus effect and selector. If you look at what focuser returns, you see that these two you'll see that these two here are exactly equivalent. That's nothing HyperApp specific again, that's just JavaScript to clean it up a little bit. Let's try it again. Yep, still works. Now, usually you wouldn't want to be creating effects like these. You hope that they would exist so you could just reuse one. But it's good to know how to make them yourself. We're going to move it into a separate file. We're going to make a library folder where we're going to make a collection of I/O utilities. And I'm going to rename this just for convenience. And then this focuser is the only one we need to export. Now I promised we'd talk about this first argument. We don't need it in this case, but the first argument is a function that is usually called dispatch. And dispatch is the internal HyperApp function that all of the event handlers in the DOM is wired to. So when you want to make an action happen, you can just call dispatch my action with some payload. Obviously, inside an effect, you wouldn't call an action directly. You'd get it from the options on fail, for example. Now that we moved the focuser effect into its own library, we need to make sure to import it here. Import focuser from libio.js. So does it still work now? Foobar. It sure does. Now that we have a generic effect for focusing input elements, I'm going to let you in on another little trick. The init prop of app, which we until now have been only using to set the initial state of the application, actually works like an action. Anything that an action can return, you can set as the init prop. That means we can set the init prop to an array where the first item is the initial state, and all the rest of the items could be effects that we want HyperApp to run for us. So in this case, we could have focuser. And now we could use a different selector. We could say new item entry input type text. And this is going to mean that right when the app starts up, this input here is going to be focused. Let's try it. We need to reload the app. See, it's focused.